Okay. So I want to start off with reading you a text. Unfortunately, I couldn't find this text anywhere in actual online in English. I found it in Hebrew, but not in English. So I thought I'll just read it to you in English instead. This is from a midrash, and it tells us the following story. I want to know what you think about it, and then it's a good introduction to our discussion. It says that both the written Torah and the oral Torah are given by God. What is the difference between them? So remember, the midrash dates back about 2,000 years. So he says like this: it can be compared to a king who had two subjects, two people that worked for him, and he loved them very much, and he decided to give them each a measure of wheat and a bundle of flax. The wise subjects took the flax and wove the beautiful cloth. He took the wheat, turned it into fine flour, sifted it, ground it, kneaded it, baked it, set it upon the table, and spread a cloth over it until the king came. But the foolish subject did nothing at all with what he was given. When the king returned to his palace, he said to his two subjects, "My sons, bring me what I gave you." The wise subject presented the bread made from fine flour with the cloth spread over it. The foolish subject presented raw wheat in a container with raw flax and on top of it. How great was the shame and disgrace of the foolish subject. So the story in short is about a king. He wants to do a good thing for two great people that have been kind to him. The one individual, to both individuals, he gives them wheat and flax. The one individual takes the wheat and flax, grinds it, and makes it, and asks, and comes and presents the king with what he has done with the wheat and flax. He's turned it into bread. The other individual, when he comes back, all he has is exactly the same wheat and flax. And it says that the second one was embarrassed. So this is what the Midrash concludes. Listen up for 1 minute. He says, when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, he presented it only in the form of wheat and flax, leaving us to extract fine flour and to weave a garment and to make into good, beautiful garments and bread. So, the part of Torah we're going to start discussing today is a part of Torah where we are supposed to ourselves get involved in. So if you recall, in the lesson 1 of Decoding Judaism, we discussed the oral Torah. And we mentioned about how the oral Torah is there in order for us to know what the basic interpretation is. It was given, Moses was told by God what is the basic interpretation. And our job was to retain that and to pass it on from generation to generation. So that's what I explained in our first class. Now we say that the oral Torah, the Midrash comes along and says that the oral Torah was there for us to add to it, for us to give, to transform it from wheat to bread, from flax into clothes. So I don't understand. My question for you is our job with the Torah to transform it, or is our job with the Torah just to guard it? What do you think? That's my question for you today. So, you don't have to jump for the answer just yet if you don't want to. But what I will do is I will share my screen if you don't mind. So today we're going to figure out how we decipher the code. Last week we discussed. Last week was supposed to be. We were supposed to do this class last week, but I was feeling a bit out of it. So last week we received God-given explanation for each of the commandments, and we spoke about that first concept of the Torah. Our question today is what happens when we have parts of the Torah which we don't have clearly in our oral tradition or written tradition. How do we figure them out? So, you know that story that I just told you about the king and the subjects. It reminds me of the story of a king that once gets lost in his field, in the forest. He's on a hunting expedition, and while hunting, he starts chasing after an animal, and he loses his entourage. And after a short while, he says he's completely lost, and starts to rain and gets dark. And eventually he finds at the edge of the forest a hut. And he's taken in the hut. And over there, he doesn't tell the person, he doesn't look like the king. He's all worn, his clothes are all soaking wet. The owner of the house, takes him in, gives him a cup of hot something to drink, and gives him a small piece of bread. And takes care of him for the night. And the next morning he asks him, tell him what's the direction back to the city. The owner of the house sends him back to the city. And a few days later, the king sends a messenger to this individual and says, I'd like to give you a gift. And he arrives at the king. He says, you know, the person you saved the other day out in the forest was really me. I'm the king. He says, oh, well, that's amazing. He says, I'd like to give you one of my most prized possessions. You saved my life. So I'm going to give you something really special. I'm going to give you my, how do you call it, lyre bird? My singing bird. I've got a bird that sings to me. He doesn't say that, he says, I'm going to give you my special bird. Here, take my bird. Oh, the man says, thank you so much. Very nice of you. And he goes back home. A year later, the king is out on another hunting expedition. He says, you know what, let's go find that house of my friend that saved my life. I want to go check on him, see how he's doing. He comes to his friend and he says to his friend, tell me, how is my precious bird doing? He says, oh, to tell you the truth, it's a hummingbird, thank you. It's a hummingbird. How's my hummingbird doing? He says, to tell you the truth, you know, I've tasted better meat before. I took it, I chopped it up, the juice wasn't that great, I've tasted better meat. So, sometimes some people look at the Torah and they see it as just another piece of meat. They don't see its potential. They don't see what it's able to do. So the first part of Torah, the truth is, all it is just reserving, and we explained how we avoid the broken telephone, why we need to have a tradition that goes from generation to generation, unbroken, explaining us the Torah. But then there's a part of the Torah which God gives us, and he says, okay, I can't give you the laws and the answers to everything. And therefore, I'm going to need you to get involved. You're going to have to tell me, you're going to have to put your own efforts in. So let's, sorry, my PowerPoint is getting stuck again. Okay, so the question is, isn't the written Torah together with the received good enough? And why is the derived Torah necessary? So the truth is like this. Remember last week we explained the first concept of what, 2 weeks ago we explained the first concept of the Torah. The first concept of the Torah is that it teaches us the necessity to read it, that we how to read the letters, the vowels, the punctuation, all that is missing, and we have a tradition. And then the most important element was the basic interpretation. That was all given to Moses on Mount Sinai. But if you look at these notes, and here's just one concept. Let's just look at the Sukkah, the laws of Sukkah. It says that you should dwell in the Sukkah for 7 days. Did Moses tell us every single law? What about, is there a maximum height? You know that according to Jewish law, we're only supposed to have a 20, up to 10 meter approximate, 20 amos high. And does the Sukkah have to be built specifically for the holiday? What are the laws? How do we get all these laws? Does the Sukkah require mezuzah? And other unique circumstances, as the world changes, this becomes extremely important. Let's say somebody lives in a mobile home. Do you have to put a mezuzah on your mobile home? Whoops, sorry, it's jumping. What about saving somebody's life? Does that mean that we have to provide a ventilator for everybody? The Torah doesn't specifically explain this concept. If someone crosses the date line while traveling from New York to Melbourne, Australia, does that affect how he observes the Shabbat or other Jewish holidays? Is it okay to use a hidden camera in your home to keep an eye on your nanny? Now, none of these circumstances were a question 3,000 years ago. Most of them were not even a question a couple of 100 years ago. So, the truth is that now more than ever, this class becomes really important. Because the question is, how does Judaism work? How do we start learning all these new laws? How do we explain them? Where do we get it from? So, I'm going to read to you, once again, I apologize that I couldn't find the exact English wording. Actually, you know what? I have something over here. I have it, but I'm just not sure if it is in the exact place.
As long as the right height and everything, we're okay.
Okay. Very good. So, 1 second. So, the important question that we want to discuss tonight. I'm sorry, my computer's playing up a bit. There you go. The important question that we wanted to discuss tonight is how we're going to figure out new laws. So, you can all imagine that it's not possible. How many? If you were to take a guess, how many books on halakha, on Jewish law, have been written to this day? How many books do you think have been written?
Thousands.
Thousands. Very good, 100%. Thousands of books. That's millions of pages. Literally millions of pages. It would have been impossible for the Jewish people to have studied every single, and not only that, most of the laws of the questions that we have in halakha today have never been, were not an issue in those days. So the question is, how are we going to derive them? Every time we had a new song, for example, today, this is a great question which I put in the WhatsApp. If you have surrogacy, right? Today, you can have a woman that is not the mother of the child carry a baby, or sorry, not the mother. It's a whole question. Who's the mother of the child? Let's say you have a non-Jewish woman that is going to carry the egg of a Jewish woman. Is that child Jewish? Is it halakhically allowed? IVF, is IVF halakhically allowed? All these questions become major questions in today's day and age. In every single generation, these questions, every single year I should say, there's more and more questions that are coming up. We've never had so many questions. And the question is, how would God set up a system that would work for 3,000 years ago, when after the time of Moses, when the Jewish people were living in the desert, they had one set of circumstances? And then the Jewish people were going to move into the land of Israel after Moses passed away, it would be a totally different set of circumstances. How is all these laws going to be able to keep up? And how are we going to be able to figure out the law when the circumstances change? As Sam correctly said, there's tens of thousands of books on halakha. Why? Because every single particular circumstance requires a new question. And that's why it requires a major rabbi to answer sometimes. Sometimes the question is a straightforward question. It's a question, a circumstance, and most of the time it is pretty straightforward. It's something that has been asked many, many times before. So the question is, how do we even get to the first one? The answer to that question is that it's done throughout the Talmud. Every single detail is constantly going to be derived from a particular way. And once you understand that there's a particular way how it's done, you can see it in your own life. We can continue using that system. So it's a system that lasts forever. So Maimonides writes in his introduction, he said, God told Moses the written verses that you shall live in the booth or the sukkah for 7 days. He also told Moshe that the mitzvah is obligatory for males but not for females, that the sick and the travelers are not required to fulfill this mitzvah, that the roof of the sukkah must be made of something that grows from the ground, that the roof cannot be made of wool, of silk, or any other items that do not grow from the ground, nor from mats and clothing. So this is generally talking about the mitzvah of sukkah. Even if they were made from something that grows from the ground, that one shall eat, drink, or sleep in the sukkah for all 7 days. That the size of the sukkah shall be no smaller than 7 handbreadths long, but 7 handbreadths wide. So all this was laws that were told to Moses. God told Moses, I want you to dwell in sukkahs for 7 days. He told him all the basic laws, the most fundamental laws. But he didn't go into the details like what's the maximum height, what happens if you're traveling, what happens if you find yourself in a strange circumstances. Those type of laws were not necessarily always discussed. In other words, when God told Moses what we discussed last week, the basic interpretation, it was the basic, the fundamental. Sometimes that could have been hundreds of points, hundreds of details about a particular law. But it was just basically the setup of what that law is. A good example of this is the laws of Shabbat. In Shabbat, in halakha, there's no area in halakha which is more pervasive than Shabbat. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of books just on the laws of Shabbat. Why? Because Shabbat has every single different circumstances. Every single medical condition can be treated on Shabbat. Every type of electric thing, can we use that on Shabbat, etc., etc. Okay. So, how are we going to derive things? So, how would they do it, for example, in secular law? How does secular law, if you have, secular law is also constantly changing.
Vote.
Sorry?
You put it up, vote.
You do what?
You vote. You vote on it.
You vote on a new law. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. One way of doing a secular law is you vote. The other way is you interpret and apply an existing legislation. So if you have a constitution, like the United States Constitution, that constitution is not really changeable. And if they want to make a change, they can, but they have to have whatever it is, 80% vote or 75% vote of the Senate and Congress to make a change. But generally it's rare to make a change to the Constitution, right? So if they want to make a law, they have to go based on existing laws. How do they do that? They interpret and apply existing laws. And then the other way they do it is, like they say, like Noach says, they vote on new laws, when you have new laws that have to come up. So the question is, how are we going to do that in a Jewish circumstances? So could the rabbis all sit around and say, okay, Should we allow people to do IVF? Okay. Whoever wants to make IVF allowed, let's have a discussion. What's the pros of IVF? And then 50 rabbis will stand up and they'll each have their 15-minute talk and why they're against and why they oppose it. Is that the way it works? You see, the difference between the Jewish system and the secular system is the Jewish system, in general, is a complete system. Now, there is space for new laws in the Jewish system. We're not going to discuss that tonight. That will be next class on this topic. How are new laws derived? How are new laws legislated? There is a concept. For example, Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not from the Torah. Okay, so this is an example of derived from the oral Torah. That's what we want to discuss tonight. So here's a great example of this idea. This idea was made up by, or this example of the Sudoku. Everyone knows how to play Sudoku? I didn't know about Sudoku till I got married. And my wife loves Sudoku, Chaimushka. So the way Sudoku works is you have a bunch of numbers and you have to try to get all the 9 numbers in a particular order in them, but they have to have 9 across and 9 in each box and 9 down, right? Some people are really good at this, and they give you a few numbers to help you out. So these numbers that are there to help you out, if you don't have them, it's impossible to figure it out, and the less numbers, the harder it is. These numbers are an example of the written law and the received law, what we discussed last week. Because the received law is, this is what you've been given. Now there's a whole massive area that you have to still go and figure out. That's the example of the derived law. Do you understand? It's a nice example. So all the questions that are left answered, therefore we need the derived law, and we can't just come to any conclusions. There are rules of how we come to those conclusions. So we have to figure out, how do we come to those conclusions? So what we're going to see is when we follow particular rules, that's what allows us to actually reach the conclusions that we are trying to reach. Okay. So my question to you is, let's say we're playing Sudoku. We're playing Sudoku with life, with laws, with how to live our life according to Torah. How are we going to fill in all these empty boxes? The boxes, empty boxes, represent all the questions and all the thousands of circumstances and details that are not discussed. How are we going to figure them out? So the answer is that there was one other thing that God gave us when He gave us the Torah. He gave us something called the 13 principles of derivation. Okay? 13 principles that teach us how to derive laws. Now the truth is that there's more than 13 principles. There's a famous rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shmuel, and he taught that these 13 principles, he taught 13 of them. But the truth is, we know that the less famously, there's 32 laws. So let me explain to you, what does it mean? How could we come up with new laws, principles? There's certain patterns that you're allowed to use in order to figure out the new laws. What are those patterns? So anybody that's learned Gemara will be very familiar with this concept. If you've learned Gemara, that I'm going to show you a few of these laws, how they work. Not all these laws, as I mentioned, are part of the 13. We actually said is part of our davening. Look at this. And I want you to try to get involved over here, okay? Try to we're going to pretend that you're learning Gemara. And we're going to do a little bit of a Gemara study over here and show you what Gemara study is like. For those that haven't studied much Gemara, you'll hear a lot about, you go to yeshiva, that you study Gemara. right? That's what we do a big percentage of our time, and a lot of it is training us how to figure out laws. That's what Gemara is. It shows you how the laws work, how Torah study works. Okay, so when you learn a book for like Rambam or like Shulchan Aruch, that is already the conclusions after the long discussions in the Talmud. The Talmud is, before they came to the conclusions, trying to figure that out. So here's an example of one of these principles that is one of the famous examples. Noah, can you think of any example of one of the Yud Gimel Midas? Sha'at Torah Nidreshet Bahem? As soon as I tell you, you'll kick yourself. I'll say a few words. Okay. So what are the principles? Principle number one. I'm not going to go through all the principles because I want to show you how they work. Kal v'chomer, right? A kal v'chomer. What is a kal v'chomer? A kal v'chomer is a harsh and a more lenient. So let me give you an example. If you ask your boss for an extra hour of lunch and he doesn't allow it, can you then say how much more so he won't allow you to take off the whole day? So you came to your boss tomorrow and you said, tomorrow I'd need an extra hour of lunch. And he says, sorry mate, you can't do it. Can you derive from that he can't, if you ask him to take off the full day, he will say no? Yes or no? What do you think? Yes? Yes. No, Yochanan's saying yes. Thank you, Yochanan. The answer is yes. Seemingly it seems like it's a good Kal V'chomer. Kal V'chomer, how much more so? What's Kal V'chomer? How much more so? If you ask your boss, can I take off the whole, just 1 hour? How much more so when you ask him to take off the whole day, he won't. Why? Because the 1 hour is 1 hour of work, and a full day is 8 hours. He will not let you take off the whole day. Make sense? Clear. Okay, so that's a very basic example. Now you got to try to pay attention. Once again, I apologize that I don't have the texts in front of you. I try to get them. Give me 1 second. So the text is as follows. So the text says, try to listen, follow along. It would be a lot easier for you if I had put it on the board, but this is what the text says. The text is a pasuk. The pasuk says, try to put on your Gemara cups for a moment. It says, if a man gives his neighbor a donkey, a bull, a lamb, or any animal for safekeeping. So what did he give it to the man for? To safekeep it, to guard it. And it dies, breaks a limb, or is captured. The guardian, the one that was holding on to it, does not need to pay. Okay? Then it goes on, but if it was stolen from him, he shall pay its owner. So if it dies, you gave it to him to watch over it. If it dies, he has to pay you back. But if it's stolen from him, he doesn't. That's a verse in the Torah. That comes from Shemot, from Exodus chapter 22. Then, two verses later, it says, but if a person borrows, if he borrows an animal from the neighbor and he breaks the limb or dies, he shall surely pay. So, let's look at it on my screen just to simplify it. It says like this. Sorry, I'm going to go back. So to summarize what I just said. This is it's much more using your brains now to figure this stuff out. You have an animal that dies naturally. The custodian, it says in the pasuk, he's not liable. But if it was stolen, he says he does have to pay back the owner. Now let's look at the borrower. The borrower, it says that he is liable if the animal dies. So what do you think the law is going to be? But it doesn't say, the Torah does not specify if the borrower has to pay back in the case of the animal being stolen. Can you figure this out? What's the law? What do you say the law is? Thinking heads. What's the law?
Non-liable,
Not liable? Why do you say that?
because it's beyond the borrower control.
But he's obligated if the animal dies.
Well, because he controlled the animal, you have to, didn't care enough the animal die, but if its animal was stolen, he lost control and he just is not liable.
Okay. Okay, that's one way of
Maybe,
looking at it.
maybe.
Very good. I like that. It's definitely a Gemara approach. Anybody wants to try any other options?
I could just go the opposite way with the borrower. I would have said that, if he was borrowing the animal and it was stolen, he wasn't looking after it very well, so he didn't care, and he's probably liable. No.
Okay. So, but what's your logic? What's your logic? The Torah doesn't tell us whether he's liable or not. We need to have a logic to figure out. So we have to base it based on what we already have. The Torah gives us 3 pieces to the puzzle. We have to figure out the 4th piece. So we have to use certain logic to figure it out. Sam wants to use one piece of logic. Yochanan, by the way, I'm not saying you're wrong. I just need you to give a bit more explanation.
I'm all ears. I'm listening.
This is good. This is where we start to use our heads to figure stuff out. Right? This is what the Gemara would say.
I think it is also, it depends if it's been stolen on circumstances. If it's been stolen, if he didn't guard properly and things had been stolen, well, that's sort of his fault. But if it's make all effort to keep it, but it be still been stolen, it's maybe get some chance to be not liable.
Okay, very good. That's true. So let me explain to you who we're talking about, give you a bit more information and see if it clarifies things. But that's the points that you've made, Sam, are very, very useful, very helpful. So the custodian is a person that's paid by the owner to watch his animal. He was not liable when the animal died, but when the animal was stolen, he was liable. Okay? The borrower was liable when the animal died. So, with that information, what can we say? Could we say what is more severe? What is considered more, so to speak, more in his control? The animal dying or the animal being stolen? What would you think? What is more in control of the individual that's watching the animal? The animal being stolen or dying?
I mean, can I just say, it depends what the animal died of. I mean, was he feeding it properly?
Dies naturally. The word is dies naturally.
Naturally.
Right. So here's the answer. When the animal dies naturally, we would say it's not really in the control of the guard. We call it a shomer. Okay? And that's why this custodian is not liable. So the Talmud gives us two answers, two kal v'chomers. And I want you to understand this. I know this is a little bit of a... If you could understand this concept, you could understand a lot the way the Talmud thinks, which is the way Jewish law thinks, and how we get to laws in Judaism. The Talmud likes to play, I wouldn't call it plays dumb, but plays as though ignorant. And it will always give us the wrong option. If there is a logical wrong option, it will always give you the logical wrong option first in the Talmud. It doesn't jump to the conclusion. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the Talmud doesn't jump to the main conclusion, but will first give us the wrong logical conclusion? Why will the Talmud do that?
Try and make us think, try and work it out ourselves, to make us
Yes.
consider the situation.
Yes, correct. But also because when it gives us that option, it wants us to show us how they reach the law. Because if it doesn't show us the wrong option, you may come up later and say, well, why didn't they answer this? By presenting the wrong option and saying, well, this is the answer, and then disproving it, it's now given us a reason to understand how they reached their conclusion. So the more options they can give us, then the better it is. And that's why you have all the commentaries on the side discussing, is that really the most logical conclusion? How did the Talmud get to it? What's really wrong with that other conclusion? And that's where you start getting all your Gemara cups, this way of thinking, which is really a very healthy way, but sometimes for people that are not used to it could be very difficult. Okay? So let's look at the Talmud. Once again, I really apologize. I don't have the actual text online, so I need you to just pay attention. The Talmud says like this. The Talmud says, if an animal died or broke a limb, it is possible for the owner to invest effort to retrieve it. But if the animal was stolen and lost, the owner can invest effort. Sorry, it is impossible. The owner can invest effort to retrieve it. So it says like this. The one answer is you say, well, he's not liable because it's not retrievable. Sorry, he is liable because over here when it dies, it's not retrievable. The animal's gone. But when the animal is stolen, the owner can still really try to get it back. Maybe the owner could still get it back. So therefore, maybe the borrower should not be liable. So therefore, we should say kal v'chomer over here. So the Talmud says no, that's not a good choice. That's not a good kal v'chomer. If the paid custodian who's exempt, you can't. That doesn't work. Why? Because the Torah tells us that over here he was exempt. So therefore, when the animal suffers a broken limb or death, is liable. When the animal is stolen, then a borrower is liable. When the animal suffers a broken limb or death, is certainly liable. When the animal is stolen or lost, this is irrefutable. So the Talmud tells us this. No, look at it this way. Look here for a second. If I say over here that if this custodian, when the animal died, was not liable, but in the case when he's stolen, he is liable, then I know for sure in this case where he is liable for the death, then for sure he'll be liable. How much more so will be liable for stolen? Do you understand? Because I've already got this information. I have the information over here that this custodian is liable only when it's stolen, not when it dies. This borrower, so I can't say that stolen is more lenient. Sorry, is more. I can't say it's more lenient than when it dies. Sorry, I'm getting very technical tonight. I'm trying to keep you awake, but I want you to really understand this concept. This is Talmud. This is, if you're a lawyer, you'd love this stuff. If you're not, probably not. So how did the Talmud organize? So what was the answer? The answer was, so there's two ways of how we could answer it. Number one, kal v'chomer is to exempt the borrower. if the borrower is liable even when it was out of his control, the borrower should definitely be liable when there was something he or she could have done about it. That's one answer. But we refute that one. Okay? Why not? Because you can't exempt, harder to exempt the borrower, it's easier to exempt Kal, it's easier to accept the borrower in that case. Okay, I'm not going to get into the thing, but here what we've seen is the Talmud gave one Kal v'chomer, how much more so, and then he refutes it. Okay, so I'm going to skip this part because we're getting a bit out of time, but I want to show you the Kal v'chomer that he did accept. And then the Talmud gave us a second Kal v'chomer. And he said like this. This Kal v'chomer says, who is it easier to exempt? The custodian or the borrower? So we know that it's easier to accept the custodian. Why? Because he was exempt from when it dies. It's harder to exempt the borrower because he was obligated, he was liable when it died. So therefore, if the custodian is exempt when the animal dies, is liable when it's stolen, how much more so the borrower who is liable when the animal dies is certainly liable when it is stolen. Is that clear, or way too technical for 9 o'clock at night?
No, it makes sense. It
makes sense?
It's clear. Yes.
If you're not too tired, this makes sense. But I understand it's 9 o'clock at night. Okay. Yeah. How are we doing for time? Okay, I'm going a bit over time. With the 13 principles, I wanted to explain to you, this is probably the most concept principle used, most regularly used principle in all of rabbinic literature. This one is called a binyan av. Now, the binyan av is basically, concept is as follows. If I have a law, the most common way of figuring out other laws is trying to find laws that are similar to it. Okay? So, this is another case where we have to be very careful, but probably about 80 to 90% of all derived laws are based on this concept. As I mentioned, there's 32 laws that we use, but a lot of them. So here's an example for today's time, and then I'll try to give you the technical. I said that when I did the other one it was a bit heavy, so I'll just give you the modern example. If your boss tells you that you can't eat lunch at your desk, do you think you can eat breakfast at your desk? So you say, binyan av, he's probably referring to that you can't eat at your desk full stop. He doesn't want your desk getting dirty. He doesn't want to get your papers full of dirt. So therefore you can't eat breakfast at your desk. So in other words, the principle, he may have specified don't eat lunch, but if you came in one day early and you wanted to eat breakfast, the answer is you can't eat that. So I know this, you don't want this to be your boss, and if this is your boss, I'm sorry. But this is the concept. The binyan av is that it's a principle that the Torah gives us, and sometimes the Torah teaches that principle in a particular case, and we want to try to use it in other cases. So, for example, a basic example, I'm going to try to do this more simply than the last time. If there's 3 types of land, there's good quality, high quality land, then there's average land, and there's inferior land. The Torah tells us that in the same portion that we mentioned earlier, if a person grazes his livestock in a field or a vineyard, so let's say you take your cow and you make it graze in a vineyard and lets the livestock loose and it grazes in another's field. This is the verse in the Torah. It says you must pay restitution from the best of his field and the best of his vineyard. So now what have you done? You've allowed your animal to go and make damage in other people's property. Right? So, any of you have a dog? Any of you have a dog? Let's try to make it a little bit more relevant to us. Some of you have a dog or a cat. Let's say your dog comes to my property and destroys or makes a mess in my property, destroys my fence, something like that. Yeah? Or now the Torah says that you now have to pay me back. So in the old days, the way they paid people their value was land. So you want to pay me back with your land. Right? So he says, how do you pay back? You're going to pay back with the best type of land. Now let's say you were driving your car down the road and you hit your friend's fence. Irene, you live in a busy corner and you've had several times people driving into twice, right? She said this is a good example for Irene. Twice it's happened to her. Thank God where I live it's a little bit less common. But if you live on like a main street on the corner, it could happen. Twice it's happened to Irene that somebody has driven their car through the front of their property. Now, the question is how do you pay back? So the old days you would pay back land for land, but which land? Don't forget every land had different value. So the answer is the Torah was there talking about a specific case, about animals going and destroying somebody else's property or destroying somebody else's belongings. And over there it said what? You pay back with the best of your property. You have good and you have worse property. You have land which is fertile and land which is rocky. Pay back with the most fertile land. Can I imply the same concept of somebody else that goes and does damages to other property? That's the question. And the answer is that would be a binyanav. Yes, the Torah spoke only about animals. But I understand from that generally that concept would apply to any case where one person goes and does damage to the other person's property. That when they're paying back, it has to be done from the best of their property. So I'm not going to get into the details of it. There's a lot more details around it, but that's a classic example. So that's a really good example for if you wanted to understand how do we derive new laws. So we're going to start wanting to derive laws about what to do about surrogacy, what to do about IVF, and soon we're coming up with cases of self-driving cars. And what happens if your self-driving car goes a little bit haywire and goes and causes an accident? Who's responsible? Do we make the person that designed the car responsible, or the owner of the car, or the person that ran it? Who knows? Whatever type of things. These are questions that rabbis are already today talking about. And what are they going to base themselves on principles in the Torah that the Torah tells us we can use those same principles to derive them to those cases. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, I gave you two of the most famous. There's another 32, so another 30 principles, but I brought you the two most common principles that we use to derive laws. Now, my question for you is this. Sorry, I'm going to just skip a few ahead. I skipped all these PowerPoints just to make it a bit. Now, this is what I want to get to you, and I want to explain to you whoops, I went too far. I want to explain to you the reasoning behind why the Torah system is like this. It's the Hasidus behind it, the Hasidic element to all this. So now I've explained to you a little bit of how the principles work, how we derive new laws. What's the purpose in all of this? Why do we have it this way? And the answer to this is that the truth is the more we get into this as the ideal system. Last week we spoke about a system which is a God-given system. Here's the laws, keep them, there's your constitution, finished. And the answer is that God didn't want, he could have, given us a book of billions of books with every single possible circumstances and said, here's the thing. Besides the fact that it would have been kind of really difficult for us to find anything, but with Google we could have found anything. He could have given us Google at the time and we would have been okay. He didn't do it that way. He wanted us to derive systems because there's two purposes of the Torah. One is that human beings come up with their own laws. They are not necessarily, there's two types of laws. There's when human beings come up with their own laws that are like secular laws. So sometimes we come up with laws, but they're not godly laws. So, you know, when good old Dan Andrews decides one day that you can wear masks, and the next day he says, okay, now you don't have to, sorry, that you must wear masks, and then he changes the law that you don't have to wear masks, he could have logic behind it. Or when Boris Johnson decides that the UK no longer has to have any COVID restrictions, there could be logic behind that. But that is a human-made law, right? There's humanness behind it, and that's great, but they're not necessarily godly laws. So we want to try to find a blend between human-made laws and God-made laws, and this is exactly what God gave us the power. So when we read, and we hear, and we memorize the divine laws, that's very godly. But that's not a very human way of doing things. So how are we going to have a human and godly? The way we do it, the perfect synthesis, is when human beings toil with their own minds to reveal the divine intent embedded in the Torah. God didn't want us to just receive the knowledge and just to say, oh, this is God's law and that's it. He wanted us to be able to understand it so much that we could figure out the hidden secrets and the new laws that we would. He wanted us to understand it properly. That's why we have scholars. Who are Jewish scholars? Scholars are people that understand all the principles really well and all of the given received laws so well, and then they take that and they use that logic to derive new laws. But those laws are not new. They were always there. They just had to be discovered, and it required a human mind to discover it. That's why, even though the Torah was given a relatively small one book 3,000 years ago, today we have thousands of books, and all of them are based on the same book. We could all relate them back and see where those laws were derived from. Almost all of them. We'll discuss them. Okay, there's one more concept over here which I'm not going to get too heavily into because I'll just touch on it, but I don't want to get to discuss the whole thing. There's another concept. Sometimes laws in Judaism have both the received element to it and the derived element to it. In other words, we have it clearly. Here's an example. In Jewish law, we know that we're not supposed to mix milk and meat. Correct? Right? We don't mix milk and meat. Now, what's the passage in the Torah? It says, Lo tavashel gedi b'chalei v'mo. You shall not cook a kid in his mother's milk. What does the written Torah says? It says, cooked a young goat in its mother's milk. The oral tell says, cooked or eaten anyway, all meat and all milk, Moses tells us. That was the received law. That was last week's class. That was the first class. But then the rabbis also derived it. And they said that there was a Kal V'chomer that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, he also taught us a Kal V'chomer of how we can also derive it. Now, I'm not going to get into the derive, it's not beyond. So the question is, why do we sometimes have both? And the answer is because when we want to express the true unity between the written and the received law, when we're able to actually figure out the written law, that shows real unity between the two parts of the Torah, the derived law and the received law. And another answer given by the Kuzari was it makes us more active in the development of the Torah. So when we have a law that was given over by Moses and he said this is an explanation, and then we go and we actually find how it's derived in the Torah, that makes us not just passive receivers of the Torah, but it actually makes us active creators of the Torah. So we've received it, yes, And thirdly, is it also helps us to remember the oral Torah. Not every single oral Torah can be both received and derived, but many have both elements. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the Torah is just a little code. It's like a little acronym to remind us. When we have the derived element and you have the oral element is the part that was given by Moses, and you then go and you discover it again through the principles, it helps us to remember it. Okay, so I just want to conclude by saying as follows. What we've discussed tonight is a really crucial element in understanding how Judaism works. Okay? Last week we understood where and the need for a oral tradition. Today we try to figure out how it is that the Torah is able to have millions or tens of thousands of laws from a very, very small book. And we explained how the Torah was actually derived and how the Torah gave us principles in order to be able to build on them. And I gave you examples of those two of those principles, two of the most common principles. And then we went on to explain how this is a purpose. God doesn't want to create a world and just give us laws and say, here, live your lives based on this. He wanted us to be active partners in His Torah. Just like what we started the class with. Remember, we started the class with the story of the king that gave his subjects wheat. The one gave him back wheat and flax, and the other one gave him back bread and clothes. God didn't want us. He gave us the Torah. He gave us the wheat and the flax. He wanted us to develop it into bread and flax. And the way we do that is by studying it, understanding it, and coming up with new ways of understanding it. So it's not enough for us just to study the Torah. We have to take the Torah and start to see it in a new light, see how we can come up with our own ideas. When we start seeing new ideas in the Torah, now you know what happens? We stop being only human and we transform into being godly. Because now we have taken God's wisdom and we have learned how to apply it in new ways to our lives. As long as we stay true to the original principles that God gave us. So you can't just make up your own principles. You can't just wake up one day and say, oh, I want to make my own laws. No, you've got to stick to the principles. And when you do that, you have partnered with God in His Torah and in creation. So I wish us all good luck. Let's all hope that we're able to truly connect to the Torah in a beautiful and divine way. I'm hoping that even though tonight was a very technical class, it gave you a little bit of insight in how the Torah works and why we have such long discussions in the Talmud till we get to conclusions, and gave you a little bit of appreciation for that. So have a good night. Thank you everybody for joining. If anybody wants to stand and ask any questions, you're more than welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yishar Koach. Laila Tov.
Oh,
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, Laila Tov.